Hello, denizens of the Sunlight Realms. Salotl here, back again with another Minecraft Speedpaint. This time, I chose to reimagine this shattered savanna biome. First step, as always, is to get the lines down. Like before, I traced over the general shapes of the formation. I like this screenshot a lot, but it did have some truly bizarre geometry, since that tall mountain and back was practically floating. Because of this, I focused mainly on getting just the general silhouettes of the rock formations down. The first bit of trouble I encountered was that after I got the base inks down, I forgot which direction was up. I used this spray as a shortcut to get perspective lines without busting out the entire grid. Only, because I goofed up my directions, I started marking the grass tufts in as if the viewer was looking up out of a hole. Once I figured out the problem, I readjusted the perspective grid and started allowing gravity to affect the grass as it ought to. Using this perspective grid was so important though, because if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have gone nearly as extreme on some of the angles, and I don't think the final piece would have looked so nice. I actually did really like the idea of the first perspective I did though, so I do very much want to try an environment piece from that angle someday. The shattered savanna is one of my absolute favorite biomes. I sincerely wish that Minecraft had added some more shattered biomes into the game, especially if there's one that has a greener aesthetic. One of my favorite rules I've had was one where I built a castle at the sky limit from the top of a shattered biome. At least pre-cave update, since caves don't spawn above a certain point, it was super easy to get started with a trench-style mob farm. I had all the gunpowder I could ask for, and once I got my hands on an elytra, I was set for life. The next thing I wanted to do was to get the base colors and value down. I aimed for a sort of brownish stone, and I liked that I took the picture at night with the moon in the background, so I made sure to keep the color palette I was working with very muted and cool. I made a small adjustment to move where the moon was, because I thought it would look nicer if peeking out of the central area. I used gradients across the larger sections of the rocks and a bit of really soft shading to help accentuate the light side of them and give a bit more color variation all over. Here, I used a different shading technique than I normally do on coloring in order to get sharp geometric lines. Instead of painting in where the shadows go, I used the selection and fill tools. I thought I'd try rendering this in a different style than the previous one. Specifically, I was aiming for a cel-shaded style, using a technique based loosely on some tutorials that had been marinating in my brain for a good little while. Since I normally tend to go for a more painterly style, trying to cel-shade, especially on a background, was a really interesting challenge. Once I reached this point of the drawing, I swapped over to a brush for the last touches on highlighting the rocks and grass with the blue tinted overlay. From here on, it really was just last effects. And of course, because it's the night sky, I added stars. It took me a bit to find the right brush, and in doing so, I discovered one that almost made it look like there was a meteor shower. Since the moon ended up being such a central part of the piece, it was looking a bit blank as just a white orb, so I went back in with a couple multiply layers and added craters. Personally, I think that's one of the biggest things that ends up selling this piece. Then, at the very end, I dropped the opacity on the line art and called it good. Alright, so here's the original screenshot. And here's the reimagining. If you'd like to see more like this, let me know down in the comments and consider subscribing. Or check out my last video in the series where I redrew the Nether's basalt deltas. Thank you for sticking through to the end, and I hope you have a wonderful day!